There came a moment when I discovered that life does not change by accident. It changes when light comes, and light comes through truth acted upon. I had heard truth for years, admired it, even agreed with it, but agreement never transformed me. Only practice did. What follows is not theory. It is experience. In one short week, 5 simple daily habits brought my life into alignment with realities that had always been mine, yet unrealized. The turning point began when I understood that life responds not to emotions but to identity. For years I had allowed feelings to define my day. If I felt weak, I assumed weakness was mine. If I felt uncertain, I postponed action. Yet feelings are only reactions, they are never creators. The moment I began each day by acknowledging who I am rather than how I feel, something fundamental shifted within me. I stopped asking myself what kind of day it might be, and began establishing what kind of person I was before the day spoke at all. Identity is not something discovered by looking inward at experience. It is revealed by truth and accepted by faith. I learned that what I consistently affirm about myself determines the boundaries of my life. When I rose each morning and declared that I am strengthened, accepted, and equipped, I was not attempting to become those things. I was agreeing with realities that already existed, whether I felt them or not. This agreement produced a quiet authority in my thinking. Doubt no longer argued freely because it had lost its platform. There is a profound difference between hoping for change and standing in reality. Hope looks forward, identity stands present. When I began to identify myself correctly, effort disappeared. I no longer strained to overcome weakness. I simply refused to claim it. Weakness ceased to be personal. It became something external, something without ownership. The mind follows ownership. Once I no longer called fear mine. It stopped governing my decisions. Words played a central role in this shift. Identity must be spoken to remain active. Silent belief rarely survives pressure, but spoken truth reinforces itself. Each declaration strengthened my awareness and brought my thoughts into order. The heart responds to the voice it hears most consistently, and I made sure that voice was aligned with truth rather than circumstance. In doing so, my inner life became stable even when outward conditions were uncertain. What surprised me most was how naturally behavior changed once identity was settled. I did not force discipline, it emerged. I did not chase confidence, it appeared. Action flowed without struggle because it was no longer trying to produce something, but to express something. Right conduct is the fruit of right identification. When a person knows who they are, they act accordingly without conscious effort. This habit also corrected my perspective toward challenges. Instead of seeing obstacles as evidence of limitation, I viewed them as opportunities to demonstrate what was already established within me. Identity does not shrink in the presence of difficulty. It is revealed by it. Each situation became a proving ground rather than a threat. Fear diminished because it could no longer question my position. Within that single week, I discovered that identity is not a future attainment, but a present acknowledgement. Life began to respond differently because I was responding differently to myself. The most important conversation I had each day was no longer with circumstances or people, but with my own heart. Once that conversation was settled, everything else fell into its proper place. The second habit brought a quiet but decisive revolution in my inner life. I discovered that truth must be received as nourishment, not merely information. Reading casually had left me informed but unchanged. I had gathered facts without absorbing life. When I altered my approach and began feeding deliberately, the words ceased to be distant and became personal. I no longer read to finish a passage. I read to encounter reality. I learned to slow down and give attention to a single portion until it registered within me. Truth has a voice, but it does not speak to haste. As I lingered, meaning unfolded naturally. The words began to illuminate thought patterns I had long accepted without question. Light does not argue. it simply reveals. Error faded not because I fought it, but because it could not survive in the presence of understanding. This feeding required expectancy. I approached the word not as a duty, but as a living source, confident that it would respond to attention. When truth is approached with hunger, it answers with clarity. I noticed that anxiety diminished without effort. Confidence emerged not as excitement, but as quiet certainty. The mind becomes settled when it is governed by something higher than emotion. What changed most was my internal dialogue. Thoughts that once dominated lost their authority because they were no longer reinforced. Truth replaced speculation. Assurance displaced uncertainty. I realized that the mind is shaped daily by what it consumes, and whatever is consumed most consistently becomes the ruling influence. By choosing truth intentionally, I was choosing stability. Feeding on truth also sharpened perception. Situations that once felt overwhelming appeared smaller, not because they changed, but because my understanding expanded. Perspective grows where truth abides. I no longer measured life by immediate impressions but by settled realities. This produced patience without passivity and confidence without pride. There was also a strengthening of inward sensitivity. I became more aware of when thoughts were out of alignment. Error revealed itself quickly, not through condemnation but through contrast. Truth establishes a standard by which everything else is measured. This awareness prevented mental drift and preserved clarity throughout the day. As this habit continued, truth ceased to be something I carried mentally and became something that carried me. In moments of pressure, the right thought surfaced without strain. In decisions, clarity appeared naturally. I understood that what is deposited deliberately will be available effortlessly. This feeding was not excessive or complicated. It was consistent. A small portion received daily proved more powerful than large portions neglected. Life responds to continuity. The steady intake of truth strengthened the inner man until fear had no argument left to present. By giving truth first place each day, I found that strength became normal. Peace ceased to be occasional. Stability replaced striving. The mind rested because it was finally anchored. Truth, once received deeply, governs quietly but completely. The third habit required a deliberate refusal to relive what no longer had authority. I discovered that failure has no power of its own. It survives only through remembrance and repetition. For a long time, I had allowed yesterday's mistakes to narrate today's expectations. I would mentally revisit what went wrong, replay conversations, and rehearse shortcomings until they felt permanent. The moment I chose to stop this practice, I interrupted a cycle that had quietly governed my inner life. Refusing to rehearse failure was not an act of denial, but of discernment. I learned that not every thought deserves attention, and not every memory deserves permission. The mind will naturally return to familiar paths unless redirected. Each time an old failure surfaced, I declined to entertain it. I did not argue with it or explain it away. I simply replaced it. Replacement is far more effective than resistance. When truth occupies the mind, error finds no space to linger. Language played a critical role in this habit. I stopped attaching personal ownership to weakness. I no longer said, "I always fail," or "I struggle with this." Those statements had kept failure alive by giving it identity and continuity. Instead, I aligned my words with strength and progress. What surprised me was how quickly the mind adjusted once the vocabulary changed. Thought patterns follow speech more readily than intention. This refusal also changed how I viewed growth. I realized that growth is hindered not by imperfection, but by fixation. When attention is constantly turned toward what went wrong, energy is drained from what could go right. By withdrawing attention from past failure, I restored momentum. Forward motion resumed naturally because it was no longer being resisted internally. Another shift occurred in how I responded to correction. Without the burden of rehearsal, correction became constructive rather than condemning. I could acknowledge an error without internal collapse. Learning replaced self-judgment. Freedom increased because identity was no longer tied to performance. When failure lost its voice, confidence gained clarity. This habit also dismantled fear of repetition. I had previously feared making the same mistakes again, and that fear often invited the very outcomes I wanted to avoid. Once I stopped replaying failure, fear diminished. The mind no longer anticipated defeat because it was no longer trained to expect it. Expectation shapes experience more than effort ever could. As the days passed, I noticed an increasing lightness in my thinking. The past no longer pulled at my attention. Mental energy returned. Creativity increased. Decisions were made with calm assurance rather than hesitation. By refusing to keep failure alive through memory and speech, I reclaimed authority over my inner environment. This habit required consistency, not intensity. Each refusal strengthened the next. The mind learned new patterns through repetition, just as it had learned the old ones. Eventually, failure ceased to present itself with urgency. It lost familiarity. In its place, strength became normal, and progress became expected. The fourth habit introduced a new atmosphere into every part of my day. I realized that fellowship is not maintained by effort, but by awareness. For a long time, I had confined communion to set moments, believing it belonged to quiet places and specific times. Outside of those moments, I lived as though I were on my own, managing life independently. When I shifted from occasional acknowledgement to continuous awareness, life slowed down internally even as activity continued externally. This awareness was not produced by constant speech or mental strain. It was a gentle recognition, an inward attentiveness that required no words. I learned that true fellowship does not interrupt work. It accompanies it. Whether walking, listening, or thinking, I remained conscious of presence rather than distance. This awareness dissolved loneliness without needing external reassurance. What surprised me was how quickly anxiety lost its grip. Much of anxiety is rooted in the sense of facing life alone. Once that sense was removed, fear had little ground on which to stand. Challenges still appeared, but they no longer felt overwhelming. The burden of self-reliance lifted, replaced by quiet confidence. Strength was no longer something I tried to summon, it was something I leaned into. This habit also refined my reactions. I became less impulsive and more deliberate. Awareness created space between stimulus and response. Instead of reacting immediately, I responded thoughtfully. This pause brought clarity. Words were chosen more carefully. Decisions were made more peacefully. Fellowship produced composure without suppression. Another change was the softening of internal pressure. I noticed how often I had driven myself with urgency, as though everything depended on my performance. Continuous fellowship corrected that illusion. I understood that guidance does not require tension. Direction often comes most clearly when the heart is at rest. By remaining inwardly connected, I found that insight surfaced naturally at the right moment. This awareness also deepened gratitude. Ordinary moments carried significance. Tasks once considered routine became meaningful because they were no longer isolated. Life felt unified rather than fragmented. There was no division between sacred and ordinary. Everything was included in the same atmosphere of presence. This produced contentment without complacency. As this habit matured, I noticed an increase in inner sensitivity. I became more aware of when my thoughts drifted into unrest or distraction. This awareness was not condemning, it was corrective. I would gently return attention inward, and peace would reestablish itself. Fellowship became self-maintaining because it was rooted in recognition, not effort. By practicing conscious awareness throughout the day, I learned that strength flows most freely when dependence replaces self-consciousness. Life became less about managing outcomes and more about trusting direction. The sense of companionship remained steady, unaffected by circumstances. In that steadiness, confidence grew, not as boldness of personality, but as quiet assurance. The fifth habit brought everything into motion. I discovered that truth, no matter how clearly understood, remains incomplete until it is acted upon. Knowledge alone had given me inspiration, but action gave me transformation. For a long time I waited to feel ready, assuming that confidence would precede obedience. What I learned was that readiness follows action, not the other way around. The moment I chose to respond immediately to what I knew, hesitation lost its authority. This habit required decisiveness rather than intensity. I stopped postponing obedience for the sake of comfort or certainty. When insight came, I acted on it at once. Delay had always allowed doubt to enter and reasoning to weaken conviction. Immediate action preserved clarity. Truth remained fresh because it was expressed while it was still vivid. Action sealed understanding in a way contemplation never could. Acting on truth also simplified life. I no longer debated endlessly with myself. Once direction was recognized, response followed. This removed internal conflict. Peace increased because there was no longer a gap between knowing and doing. The mind rests when alignment is established. Disobedience, even subtle, creates unrest, while response produces quiet assurance. Another effect of this habit was the strengthening of confidence. Each action taken reinforced the next. Courage grew through use, not reflection. I realized that strength is revealed in motion. Waiting for courage had kept me stationary, but movement produced it naturally. Fear diminished because it was not consulted. When fear is ignored, it weakens. This habit also sharpened discernment. By acting promptly, I learned through experience rather than speculation. Results provided feedback. Adjustments were made quickly because I was engaged rather than stalled. Progress accelerated because learning was active. Truth became practical, not theoretical. Immediate action also prevented overcomplication. The mind has a tendency to add unnecessary layers of analysis. By responding simply, I avoided confusion. Direction became clearer because it was not clouded by excessive reasoning. Action kept life uncomplicated and forward-moving. There was also a noticeable increase in authority. Acting on truth carries an inward conviction that cannot be imitated. Words gained weight because they were supported by experience. Confidence was no longer borrowed from ideas, it was grounded in practice. This authority was quiet but unmistakable. As this habit continued, trust deepened. I learned that guidance unfolds as it is followed. The next step becomes visible only after the previous one is taken. By acting immediately, I stayed in rhythm with direction. Momentum replaced stagnation. This habit unified everything learned in the previous days. Identity found expression. Truth found embodiment. Fellowship found movement. Life shifted from preparation to participation. Action did not exhaust me, it energized me. By responding promptly to what I knew, I discovered that progress is not forced, it is released.